There is a moment in aerial combat that every fighter pilot dreaded more than the fight itself. The moment when the aircraft was gone, the parachute was open, and the man was floating helplessly in the sky with nothing between him and the ground except silk and gravity. Completely defenseless. Unable to fight, unable to run, unable to do anything but hang there and wait. And some P-51 Mustang pilots looked up at that man, lined him up in their gun sights, and pulled the trigger. What you are about to hear is one of the most morally uncomfortable chapters in the entire history of aerial warfare. And the men who did it were not monsters. That is what makes it so difficult to understand. To grasp why this happened, you need to understand what a fighter pilot actually represented in the Second World War. He was not an infantryman. He was not replaceable in the way that ground forces, as brutal as that sounds, could be replaced with a draft notice and 6 weeks of basic training. A fully qualified fighter pilot in 1944 represented somewhere between 18 months and 2 years of intensive, expensive, and extraordinarily dangerous training. The United States Army Air Forces spent an estimated $150,000 training a single combat-ready pilot, which in today's terms translates to well over $2 million. And money was only part of it. The knowledge inside that pilot's head, the instincts built through hundreds of hours in the cockpit, the ability to read the sky, to anticipate enemy movement, to survive the specific and unforgiving environment of high-altitude combat that could not be manufactured on an assembly line. A factory could build a new P-51 in days. Nobody could build a new ace in days. When a German pilot stepped out of a burning Messerschmitt over occupied France or Germany itself, he was likely to be back in a cockpit within a week. The Luftwaffe had well-organized recovery systems for pilots who went down over friendly or occupied territory. They had medical infrastructure, replacement aircraft, and an urgent institutional need to put experienced men back in the air as fast as possible. By 1944, experienced Luftwaffe pilots were among the most valuable military assets Germany possessed, because training programs had been devastated by fuel shortages and the relentless attrition of years of air war. The veterans who survived were irreplaceable, and the American pilots who encountered those parachutes knew it. This is the logic that some P-51 pilots followed when they made the decision to fire on a descending airman. It was not rage, though rage certainly existed in aerial combat. It was not sadism, though perhaps in isolated cases it was. For many of the men who admitted to it, it was a cold, strategic calculation. That man floating down is not finished. He is temporarily inconvenienced. If he lands safely, he will eat dinner tonight, sleep in a bed, climb into another cockpit tomorrow morning, and the next American pilot he encounters might not come home. Remove him now, while he is helpless and the opportunity exists, and that future engagement never happens. That American pilot lives. The logic is horrifying in its clarity. It is also the logic of total war applied to an individual human being hanging from a parachute, and that tension never fully resolves no matter how long you think about it. The practice was widespread enough to have a name. Pilots called it various things depending on nationality and unit, but the concept was universally understood across every air force in the conflict. It happened on all sides. Luftwaffe pilots did it to American and British airmen over the English Channel, where a pilot who survived the bailout would likely drown in freezing water within minutes anyway, and some German pilots decided to accelerate that outcome. Soviet pilots did it systematically in the early years of the war, when they had neither the fuel nor the operational capacity to allow recovering German pilots to re-enter the fight. Japanese pilots did it with particular frequency in the Pacific, where the cultural framework around surrender and capture produced a different calculus entirely regarding enemy combatants in any state of vulnerability. The P-51 pilots who engaged in the practice were participating in something that had no clean national ownership. It was a product of the war itself. What is perhaps most striking about this chapter of air war history is that some of the men involved were willing to talk about it. Not all of them. Most took it to their graves or denied it entirely, but some spoke with a directness that is almost shocking given how uncomfortable the admission is. Franz Stigler, the German Luftwaffe ace who would later become famous for escorting a crippled B-17 to safety in an act of extraordinary chivalry, acknowledged openly in interviews that the practice existed within the Luftwaffe, and that he had personally refused to participate in it because of values instilled in him by his commanding officer, the ace Gustav Rödel. Rödel had told him early in his career that a man in a parachute was no longer a threat and that shooting one was murder, not combat. Stigler internalized that, and it shaped not only his refusal to shoot parachuting airmen, but ultimately the decision to protect that crippled American bomber. His choice to follow that moral line was notable precisely because the alternative was normalized enough to require a deliberate, principled rejection. On the American side, several veterans in post-war interviews and memoirs acknowledged witnessing or participating in the practice, typically with a combination of justification and unease that suggests the moral weight never fully disappeared. Hub Zemke, the commanding officer of the 56th Fighter Group and one of the most respected American fighter leaders of the war, discussed the practice in terms that acknowledged its existence as a genuine tactical consideration debated among pilots. He did not celebrate it. He framed it as one of the darker realities of a war that had long since abandoned clean categories. Chuck Yeager, who would later break the sound barrier and become one of the most famous aviators in American history, was candid in his memoir about strafing ground targets that included German personnel in ways that pushed hard against the boundary of accepted conduct. He described the air war over Europe as a place where the normal rules of human behavior had been systematically dismantled by the scale and brutality of what was happening on the ground and in the sky, and where pilots made decisions that they might not be able to explain to someone who had never been up there. The specific tension around P-51 pilots and this practice has a particular context worth understanding. By 1944, P-51 Mustangs were flying deep escort missions into Germany itself, protecting bomber formations all the way to targets like Berlin, Schweinfurt, and Regensburg. These were the missions where the Luftwaffe concentrated its most experienced pilots in desperate defense of the Reich. The air battles were ferocious and personal in a way that earlier escort missions had not been. American bomber crews were dying in enormous numbers, and the fighter pilots escorting them watched it happen on every mission. They knew the pilots climbing into those German interceptors were the same men who had been killing their friends for months. When one of those men exited his aircraft over German territory with a functioning parachute, the escort pilot faced that decision in a matter of seconds, with adrenaline still surging from the engagement, with the memory of burning B-17S still present, with the knowledge that the man floating in front of him would almost certainly be flying again within days. There is also a category of the practice that sits in slightly different moral territory, which is the strafing of airmen who had already reached the ground. This happened with documented regularity on both sides. A pilot who had landed by parachute in open terrain, still in his flight suit, potentially still armed with a sidearm, was in an ambiguous state. Was he a surrendering prisoner? Was he an evading combatant? In the chaos of tactical air war, the answer was often decided by whoever arrived overhead first, and it was not always decided in the landed pilot's favor. What the historical record ultimately shows is that aerial warfare in the Second World War produced moral situations that existing ethical frameworks were not equipped to handle, and that individual pilots were left to navigate those situations with their own conscience, their unit culture, the example of their commanding officers, and the immediate operational reality of what they were experiencing. Some drew lines, some did not. Some drew lines and then crossed them in the heat of combat and spent decades afterward trying to reconcile that. The men who flew P-51s were not a monolithic group with a unified ethical code. They were 22-year-olds from Ohio and Texas and California who had been placed inside the most expensive and lethal weapons system their country could produce and sent to participate in an industrial-scale effort to destroy another nation's capacity to wage war. The question of whether shooting a parachuting pilot was murder, or tactics, or something in between does not have a clean answer in 1944, and it does not have a clean answer now. What it has is the testimony of the men who were there, some of whom justified it, some of whom refused it, and some of whom carried the weight of it in silence for the rest of their lives. The sky over Europe was not a place where simple moral clarity survived contact with the reality of what was happening. And the P-51 pilots who flew through it were operating in a world where the only certainty was that the man in the other cockpit was trying to kill you before you could kill him. What happened after the cockpit was empty, when the silk was open and the man was falling, was the moment where the war asked its hardest question. The answers those pilots gave say something profound about what total war does to the human capacity for mercy, and why the line between warrior and executioner, in the air and everywhere else, is thinner and more contested than we are comfortable admitting.